Today's lesson, we want to continue with some introductory remarks before we get into the text of the Old Testament book of Hosea. We've covered some ground in the first 2 or 3 lessons already, but we still have some work to do to prepare us to better understand what we're going to find there within the letter itself. Last lesson, we talked about the blessings and the curses that went with the Sinai covenant of God. And understanding the book of Hosea, the message of the book of Hosea, in some measure is going to depend on understanding God's covenant and the warnings and the blessings that he promised to those who would either obey or rebel against him. Hosea contains a series of blessings and curses announced for Israel by God through the prophet Hosea. We're going to discover that each blessing and curse Hosea talks about is really based upon something that God revealed earlier through the Mosaic law. Some blessings and curses are going to be so similar that it's almost as if Hosea is citing them, although that wouldn't be, they didn't understand that process necessarily in those days. But although Hosea's style was in many ways original, his message was not at all innovative. Hosea's task was simply to warn that Israel, that God intended to enforce the terms of his covenant. In fact, that's really the job of every old covenant prophet, right? Again, they're not making these things up on their own. They're going back to what God previously revealed, and through these men, God is holding the people accountable to what they agreed there in that covenant. Because of the characteristics of the northern kingdom of Israel, and that's who Hosea is prophesying to, because of the characteristics of Israel in the mid-8th century BC, God's prophetic word could hardly have been predominantly positive. Israel was continuing a history of covenant breaking, and her Lord was determined to move against his people by unleashing the punishments specified in the law. God's going to keep his promises for good or worse. In the short run, of course, we're going to see that in Hosea that God's plan for his people was one that would necessarily seem to them negative. Nobody likes to be disciplined, but that was what was being called for. And in the short run, that's exactly what God was warning through Hosea. In the longer run, though, on the other hand, God's overall plan for blessing his chosen nation would still prevail. Accordingly, the book of Hosea, as we'll see, now and again contains reminders to the faithful that God would one day again bring prosperity to Israel. But the vast majority of the oracles God spoke through Hosea were negative, and we'll see that most were not positive, and they depend for their substance upon the deposit of covenant curses found in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. I believe at the end of class period last time we talked about perhaps you having a chance to read through Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 4, and then Deuteronomy chapters 28 through 32, and the whole end of that book. In each of those settings, God spoke very plainly about the blessings associated with obedience and the curses and wrath that would come due to disobedience. And Hosea is just going back and recounting that. As far as the basic message of the book of Hosea contains both predictions of destruction and predictions of restoration. We see that often in the prophets, don't we? Yes, times are going to get worse before they get better, but ultimately it's God's purpose to restore the remnant. Punishment, though, as I mentioned a moment ago, predominates over promise by a substantial margin. There is no particular pattern discernible in the way that the oracles of hope are distributed among the numerous oracles of doom, and it goes back and forth in the book of Hosea. The oracles or speeches of Hosea do reflect in their message the chronological supposition found throughout the Old Testament pre-exilic prophets. And Hosea isn't alone here. In the short run, in the short term, there's going to be pain and destruction due to their disobedience, but later there will come a time of blessing and restoration. So it's not all bad. The blessing portions of the book are therefore eschatological, and that's just a fancy word speaking of last times. The Bible often speaks, the prophets often spoke of in latter days or in the last days, that the fortunes of the people, the faithful, would be restored. And that's the blessings kind of fall in line with that. The curses, as we're going to learn, will be more immediate. In fact, if Hosea begins to prophesy in about 750 BC, it's only going to be about 3 more decades, some 30 years, before the Assyrians come in and take them out by the leadership of God. There's going to be no hint in the book of Hosea that Israel can actually escape the wrath of God expressed in the destruction and exile that is promised there. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 20 through 31, we find, if you will, an encapsulated historical perspective of Israel's history upon which Hosea's speeches are going to be based. A total of 5 stages may be identified in the history of the chosen people. We see it in different places throughout Scripture, but let me read Deuteronomy chapter 4. We'll start in verse 20 and read through 31. And again, this is just a capsule look at Israel's history, and it's going to provide kind of a template that Hosea is going to work from. I'll read the verses and we'll come back and talk about them just a little bit more. Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 20 and following. It says, "But the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace from Egypt to be a people for his own possession as today." Again, Moses writing to them shortly before they go into the promised land here in Deuteronomy 4. "Now the Lord," verse 21, "was angry with me," Moses says, "on your account, and swore that I would not cross the Jordan, and that I would not enter the good land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. For I will die in this land, I shall not cross the Jordan, but you shall cross and take possession of this good land. So watch yourself, that you do not forget the covenant of the Lord your God, which he made with you, and make for yourselves a graven image in the form of anything against which the Lord your God has commanded you. For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God." Verse 25, "When you become the father of children and children's children, and have remained long in the land, and act corruptly, and make an idol in the form of anything, and do that which is evil in the sight of the Lord your God, so as to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, that you will surely perish quickly from the land where you are going over the Jordan to possess it. You shall not live long on it, but will be utterly destroyed. The Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord drives you. There you will serve gods, the work of man's hands, wood and stone, which neither see nor hear nor eat or smell. But from there you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him if you search for him with all your heart and with all your soul. When you are in distress and all these things have come upon you in the latter days, you will return to the Lord your God and listen to his voice. For the Lord your God is a compassionate God. He will not fail you, nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant with your fathers, which he swore to them." Now, as you listen along or followed along in your own Bible, perhaps you picked up on several themes that are mentioned there. That reading of 11 or 12 verses there, again, encapsulates a large swath of Israel's history, doesn't it? A total of 5 stages you may have picked out in that reading is a history of the chosen people. Stage number 1, of course, was the Exodus wilderness stage, in which the people of Israel were rescued from slavery by God's grace, gathered into a people. Hosea is going to mention that, or allude to it at least, in chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. Then stage number 2 is the making of the covenant. God brought the people out of Egypt, and it wasn't long before they were at Mount Sinai, and God gave them the terms of the covenant, and the people agreed, and it included these blessings and cursings that were part of that as well. Israel said, "We will do it." Stage number 3, the period of blessings, commencing with the covenant and continuing through some of Israel's history until the point at which Israel's unfaithfulness became so rife that the covenant is broken and the blessings are withdrawn. So things went well for a while. The people listened. but then they became unfaithful, and the period of blessings gave way to the period of the curses that were promised there in Deuteronomy chapter 4. During this time, Israel will undergo death, disease, destruction, and deportation. We'll see that over and over again in Hosea chapter 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, and numerous places will reference some of these curses. Most of the book of Hosea concerns predictions of this fourth stage. Of course, Hosea's job as a prophet was to announce the onset of God's discipline. Then finally, stage 5 would be this period of eschatological blessing. After destruction and discipline and ultimately exile, and only thereafter, Israel will again be restored. True Israel will be restored to God and blessed. And Hosea will make reference to that in several places as well. It's important, of course, to understand that the promise sections do not hold out hope for the avoidance of divine wrath, but they follow Deuteronomy 4, Leviticus 26, and Deuteronomy 30, and expected blessings only after the curses of the covenant have been unleashed. All right, so just because the people see the error of their ways in Hosea's time doesn't mean that the destruction and exile are going to be forgiven. No, they're going to go ahead. By this time, it's too late. It's in the latter days, the last days, when the blessings would return. Once the covenant is broken or abrogated, blessing must await the full measure of divine punishment. Blessings are thus always eventual, while the curses, again, are more immediate. So let's talk a bit about the historical setting of the book of Hosea. Hosea was a prophet in a particular time in Israel's history, again, middle 8th century BC, 760, 750, roughly. Hosea the prophet was called by God to prophesy the destruction and exile of Israel at a time when Israel was at the height of its prosperity. So early in Hosea's ministry, things were going pretty well in the northern kingdom. In the latter years of the reign of King Jeroboam II, and he reigned from 793 to 753, so 40 years, which was a long time for a king in Israel or Judah. Probably not much earlier, though, than 760 BC, Hosea began his ministry through the enactment prophecy of marrying, as it says there in chapter 1, a wife of harlotry. Only a few years before the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria changed Israel's attitudes from complacency to desperation. So again, the beginning of the reign was marked by a period of complacency and prosperity in the northern kingdom. And as often happens, among God's people, it's the good times that sometimes leads us astray, and it did to God's people there. They syncretized their worship with the false gods and idols, and became pretty lazy spiritually, and that brought on again the need for a prophet to make an effort to call them back to God. The Jehu dynasty, which began in 842 BC, came to an end with the death of Jeroboam II, in 753. As I said a moment ago, it was the northern kingdom's longest dynasty. Thereafter, beginning with the accession of Zechariah to the throne in Samaria in 753, attempts at continued dynasty proved futile. So it's at the death of Jeroboam II, who reigned for 40 years. He died in 753. That time of prosperity and relative calm gave way to a more troubling time. The order of the day following Jeroboam II's death in Israel, the northern kingdom, was usurpation by assassination. Hosea eventually prophesied during the reigns of more kings than any other Old Testament prophet. So regimes changed often during the prophetic ministry of Hosea. 6 kings governed the north during the remaining 30 years of the northern kingdom until its fall in 722, ultimately. None of those 6 kings following Jeroboam II was notable for his administration or diplomatic skills. Life in Israel at this time, beginning in about 753, became increasingly precarious. The nation's fortunes waned progressively. These developments are reflected in the book of Hosea, which appears to proceed more or less chronological from the 750s BC to the 720s in the ordering of Hosea's oracles. So when we get into the book itself, we'll kind of see, again, you can't really put a date on any of his prophecies. They're not given in the book, but it does seem to follow this pattern from a time of prosperity to a time of great struggle. The complacency of the early days, and we'll see that in Hosea 2, verses 7, 10, and 15, gives way to a desperation in foreign and domestic affairs evidenced in the latter chapters of Hosea, places like chapter 7, verses 8 through 12, really in several places in chapter 7, verses 3 through 7, chapter 12, verse 1, and chapter 13, verses 10 and 11. So we'll see that later toward the end. The Syro-Ephraimite War of 734 BC, which ended with the capitulation of the north to Assyria after Israel was reduced to a client state by the Assyrian conquest and a Judean invasion, mentioned in chapter 5, verses 8 through 10, represented the beginning of the end for Hosea's native kingdom. We have no way of answering with certainty a number of key questions about the setting of Hosea's prophetic ministry, and often the prophets are like this. They were written for a certain people in a certain time in a certain setting. Now, there's things we learn from it, but again, that's why they perhaps don't settle, say this happened then and then, because it was happening in real time to them. So we have no way of knowing certain things. The book of Hosea never states the location of any of his preaching. We may likely guess that Hosea delivered many of these oracles or speeches frequently at Samaria. That was the city capital of the northern kingdom. And at least prior to 734 BC, when Bethel, the city in the north, likely reverted to Judean control as Bethel as Amos did, but we have no hard evidence. None of the oracles are specifically dated. While we may be fairly confident of the general dating of some, examples would be chapter 1, verses 2 through 9, and chapter 5, verses 5 through 10, and of the approximate chronological ordering of most, our analysis of the setting remains ultimately speculative in any sense, and it really doesn't take away a whole lot from understanding what's going on. But again, got to be careful about date setting here as far as specifics. Well, scholars wonder if Hosea ever had any contact with Amos, his somewhat older contemporary in the north. Amos was a prophet as well in the northern kingdom in much the same time period. Or you wonder if he ever rubbed shoulders with some of the younger contemporary Orthodox Judean prophets. We have, again, no way of knowing. Speculation at best. With regard to his audience, Hosea may have enjoyed some faithful reception of his oracles among the small percentage of northerners yet concerned to keep the Mosaic covenant. He doesn't make any mention of that either, nor do his words hint at it, but his words surely met with some resistance, obviously, as well. Now, again, there was a faithful remnant, even in the north. God always has a faithful remnant. So some of these messages of Hosea might have resonated with faithful people, but by and large, these oracles of Hosea were probably met with resentment and ridicule, as most of the prophets were, perhaps even utterly ignored by the vast majority of those who heard them. Orthodox worship of God had become a small minority religion in Israel by Hosea's time, judging from the consistently discouraging reports of its status in the historical books and the prophets, right? Just read the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. That'll kind of give you a history of the time, some of the time frame, and it's not very encouraging reading for the people of God, especially in the north. While Judah, the kingdom in the south, you might refer to it as the Bible Belt among the two kingdoms, had perhaps resisted the encroachment of foreign religious practices somewhat more effectively than had happened in the north, chapter 1, verse 7. Israel in the north, of course, was no place for Hosea to find a sympathetic audience. And most prophets, that was their lot as well. The burgeoning military and economic power of the northern kingdom in the days of Jeroboam II. You can read about that in 2 Kings chapter 14, verses 25 through 28. And the tendency in the north to have greater international contacts in the more isolated Judah in the south undoubtedly resulted in a cosmopolitan, tolerant attitude religiously. Polytheistic syncretism, a mixing, not exclusive monotheistic worship of God, constituted the dominant faith, and that's what Hosea was facing, calling these people back to the worship of the one and only true God. During the many centuries that had passed between the establishment of the Mosaic covenant in Hosea's day, and by the way, if you're going to put the entry of the people of God into Canaan around 1400 BC, and Hosea's, prophesying about 750, you've easily got about another 700 years between the giving of the covenant at least and the giving of these prophecies. Given that lapse of time, the Sinai law code had fallen into a limbo of neglect. And as time went on, many of the Israelites wandered farther and farther away. Some portions, of course, of the old law were popularly known, and most Israelites probably knew about the law in the same way that most Americans would know about the Sermon on the Mount, even though they would be unable to describe its contents accurately. So, there would have been a superficial knowledge. Yeah, we made a covenant with God, but they didn't care much about it. Probably couldn't quote much about it. The prophets such as Hosea had to rely in some measure upon a common ground of awareness of the law, limited as it was, in proclaiming the enforcement of the divine covenant. Remember, Hosea is, if you will, just the officer or messenger of God, reminding these people of what they should have known and should have paid attention to. The average Israelite surely recognized that the law of the Pentateuch forbade things like idolatry and polytheism, insisted upon the worship of Yahweh at a single central sanctuary, in the life of basic ethical righteousness, and provided blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. It's this common knowledge of a few basics that affects in part the frequency of the repetition of certain themes in the prophetic oracles of Hosea. By reminding the people through his prophets, God, that even these well-known foundational stipulations of the covenant had been violated, God gave more than sufficient notice of justification for the coming judgment. This shouldn't have been any surprise to any Israelite alive. Yes, some time had elapsed, but it was due to their own neglect if they'd forgotten these things. God doesn't just bring the judgment without reminding them. No, through the prophets, he says, all right, this is coming, and here's why. It was enough, of course, to demonstrate major violations like Hosea does, things like idolatry and polytheism, disloyalty due to foreign entanglements, multiple sanctuary worship, dishonesty, economic oppression. All of these things come up. The presence of these violations proved that the covenant was broken. Any one of them would have sufficed for that purpose, right? It didn't have to have just one violation. Like the New Testament says in James chapter 2, you're guilty of all. Cumbersome delineations of large numbers of the 613 commandments that many count in the Pentateuch was not warranted. It's no wonder that they're not found in Hosea and the other prophets. So God doesn't have to give a laundry list of everything that they were disobeying. He provides enough through the prophet to show that they are indeed guilty and that the judgment he's bringing is ultimately deserved. So hopefully that helps some, just to kind of set the stage for the message of Hosea. We want to spend just a little more time next week, and we may do this as we begin the text. We want to talk some about Hosea, the prophet himself, and his family, because his family comes into play in the study of this book. He marries a woman named Gomer, and it's Hosea's family life that becomes teaching aid, if you will, for the prophetic message of the book of Hosea. So, Lord willing, you can look forward to talking about that next time. Thank you for clicking on the video and watching and studying along with me. I encourage you to continue to read the book of Hosea, and as we make our way into the text, we'll see how some of these introductory matters come into sharper focus as we see what God had to say through this prophet to the northern kingdom. God bless, and I pray that your study of God's word will be productive.